I'm very happy to be able to introduce a good colleague, Dr. Nia Dowell. She is at the University of Michigan working on her postdoc. She did her PhD with Art Gracer from the University of Memphis. Nia, I think, to me, represents the best of higher education, an individual with brilliance, passionate about the work that he does, creative about the ways in which he needs, and really exhibits a strong collaborative spirit. So it's always a pleasure to have Nia join us here at UTA. I think she's been here 3 or 4 times now, and it's always great having her down. More recently, she shared a paper with a group of us that she's been working on, a group communication analysis, and she'll share a little bit of that with us. The discussion is fairly informal, meaning she's going to present. If there's periods where we have a question, feel free to raise your hand. Otherwise, there'll be some time to pause for questions. So with that, Nia, welcome.
Thank you. And I'm really excited to be back in the Link Lab. As George said, if you have any questions, just interrupt me because it's better to answer them as we go. So over the past 1.5 or 2 years, I've become very fascinated with roles. And this is because roles are I think, the cornerstone of human sociocognitive behavior. Because when individuals interact, they act in ways that are both constrained by and enabled by the social structure. And that means the social history that participants have with each other, the context in which an interaction takes place, but also the individual attributes an individual brings to the table. And so because of that, sociocognitive roles allow us to understand human behavior. So if you think about your everyday interactions, you can see that there are many faces to your social identity. So for instance, you may occupy one social role in a professional setting when you're giving a presentation like I am, or another role when you're working with colleagues and trying to find potential lines of collaboration. And then in another formal setting, you might occupy a completely different role that also doesn't look anything like the roles that you occupy with your friends and your family. So for instance, if I tried to play my cheetah role here today, it might not be as well received as it was with my family during Christmas. And that is to say that roles are explored across a number of different disciplines, including psychology, sociology, education, all trying to understand what are the processes involved in who we are and how do those things manifest during social interactions. Now today I'm going to be talking about collaborative learning, collaborative problem solving, but I do want to stress that the methodology I'll be talking about is flexible enough to be applied in any online environment where people are interacting. So in the literature, there are 2 prominent views of roles. The first one is assigned roles, and in this context, an educator, a teacher or a researcher might assign a student a particular role, like you're the leader, you're the summarizer, and then the individual performs a behavior associated with that role. Now, there's been tons of evidence showing the benefits of doing this, right? So it's useful for both group learning and individual student learning. But there are some non-trivial concerns. So one is that, what about dysfunctional roles? So obviously when people are assigned roles, they are assigned roles that are thought to be productive for outcomes. However, we know that there's a prevalence of dysfunctional group behaviors, such as the bad apple phenomena. And so assigning these roles limits our understanding of the impact of dysfunctional group roles. And then the second is, what are we measuring? So just because I tell Justin or George to act a certain way does not mean that they're going to act that certain way and they're not going to deviate from that role. And so that is to say, are we measuring roles as intended or roles as enacted? Also, a single role inhibits group and individual flexibility and the potential benefits associated with that. And then finally, and I think probably the most important, that assigning roles disregards the dynamic and interactive way in which roles are created, negotiated, and evolve naturally within a social interaction. And that's why lots of researchers, including myself, have been fascinated by this idea of emergent roles. Emergent roles develop organically out of the social interaction. They are defined by and characterized by their behavioral proximity to their interactional partners. So in the literature, there are two main ways that people look at emergent roles. And one is using either manual content analysis or very complex taxonomies to try and understand the roles that are emerging in social interactions. Now, Strauss and Delot were very foundational in the work that I'm about to talk about here. In there, they wrote a conceptual paper in 2010 where they outlined both emergent roles in small group interactions, but also large group interactions. And they said that roles are divided along two dimensions. One is effort, and the other is group orientation. So whether or not an individual is oriented towards themselves or towards the group goals. This seems simple, but it's actually quite interesting when you align this with a lot of the theoretical work coming out of the team literature as well as the educational literature. So this was a great starting place, but it has limitations of the manual content analysis approach, which ignores the sequential and semantic information that characterizes the interaction between people and their discourse connections over time within an interaction, right? It also isn't a viable option with the scale of educational data. So other people have tried automated methods, namely a social network analysis, and even the work being done here is quite scarce across all of these areas that I've talked about. In social network analysis, roles are defined by the regularities and network attributes an individual exhibits in a network, and then characterizes the roles that they occupy within that network. So this is a really great attempt because it limits the human requirement and time requirements needed to analyze the data and explore the roles that people are occupying. But it also is limited in the fact that it's only these basic, shallow structural measures. So what are they saying? How are they interacting? Not how many times did I tweet at Pete today or George today, but I want to get down into like what is the meaning and the connection between people. And so that's why I think that natural language processing would be a useful way forward to help us start answering these questions. And so in particular, I'm fascinated by how we can use these computational modeling to capture the conversational dynamics that are reflective of important sociocognitive processes, which characterize the roles that people occupy in online multi-party interactions. So this is the data that we typically deal with, which is wonderful. We have time, we have group, sometimes, and we have the speaker of the discourse and the actual discourse that they said. It can look slightly different, but overall this is what you have. There's so much meaning in here that we're not capturing with our current methods that we completely ignore. And what I wanted to understand was how do I get from this to something more meaningful where I can actually infer the connections between people over time as they interact. So here we have person A, B, C, D, and we have time. And I want to understand what are the connections and what does that mean for the sociocognitive processes and over time for that person, and ultimately what does that mean about the role that they are occupying in that group. In order to do this, you have to infer the semantic information between this. So the group communication analysis that I'm going to talk about is primarily based on latent semantic analysis. And this is just a method that allows you to capture the semantic overlap between any stretch of text. So it can be between words, between larger documents, or between contributions within a multiplayer online interaction. So the group communication analysis is made up of 6 different measures currently. And I derived these measures by exploring all of the team literature, the computer-supported cognitive learning literature, the organizational psychology literature, and you might think that there are a lot of differences across these disciplines, and there are, but the communicative processes that they outline are almost identical as of being important in interaction. So the first one is obvious, and we've seen this in every paper that we've ever seen. How much do you participate? So I capture participation dynamics. The remaining, however, are based on this latent semantic analysis, these discourse cohesion connections. So first we have 3 responsivity measures. The first being your overall responsivity. So when I say something in a group, is it connected to the previous contributions of my interactional partners? Or am I just saying something that's completely irrelevant and not seen as meaningful? And then there's internal cohesion. So this gets at the self-regulatory and monitoring behavior. Am I building on and also aware of my own previous contributions to the group? And then your social impact. So when I make a contribution in an online interaction, does that move the conversation forward in any way? And you can calculate that by looking at my contribution and the semantic relationship between the following contributions that happen by other group members. Am I stimulating a conversation? Am I seen as meaningful by my peers? And then coming out of the team literature, we have newness. So this is a measure of how much new information I'm providing. So am I echoing previously given information, or am I providing something new that hasn't been said to the group? And communication density, which also comes out of the team literature by Peter Foltz and others. And so the idea here is how much semantic information is packed into a contribution. I almost think about tweets up here because they used to be shorter, but how much meaningful semantic information is packed into a contribution. And so this feeds into the idea of common ground. So to establish common ground, it's one of the main things that you do in a social interaction, so therefore you can move forward. Everybody knows what everybody else is talking about. So people with higher common ground typically have shorter, denser, semantically denser contributions. Anybody have any questions with that? Okay. Okay, so using this, I explored multiple data sets, but the first one we'll talk about was a huge introductory psychology course. So imagine a large auditorium with a ton of undergraduate students that are super excited to get on their computer and interact with each other. So for this, there were 840 participants that were randomly assigned into 184 groups. They first read material related to their interaction. So in this case, it was on narcissism and personality disorders. And then they logged onto an educational platform. They took a pre-test. And then they were randomly assigned into groups of, I think the mean was 4.3, so about 5 students. They interacted for 20 minutes. They were given talking questions so that the conversation didn't get awkward and no one said anything. And then they logged out and took a post-test. So for this, I wanted to look at both student and group level measures. So the student level measure is obviously the pre and post test where you just get the learning gains associated between those two. But I wanted a completely separate group level measure. And so to do this, I used topics modeling to calculate the proportion of on-topic discussion a group had during their interaction. So cluster analysis was used to detect these roles, and prior to clustering, I split the data into testing and training. I checked for multicollinearity and cluster tendency, which is particularly important here because unsupervised machine learning models will cluster anything that you give it. So you should make sure before you do it that your data might have inherent clusters within it. And next, we look at optimal number of clusters. So the most common method here is within sum of squares, and it's called the elbow method, where you choose where the elbow is, and that's the number of clusters you should use. However, there have been more advanced methods developed recently that take, because I think in total there are like 50 different measures of quality for optimal number of clusters. So they take 26 different clusters, and they use the majority rule to help you decide along these different indices, how many indicate that this is the optimal number of clusters. So I did this using 2 different methods. So there's PAM, which is similar to k-means, and k-means clustering. So using the PAM method, that suggested 2 was the optimal number of clusters. And the k-means, with using the same approach, suggested 4. Now, 2 is very, very boring, because it literally just splits individuals on high and low, so it's not theoretically meaningful. So then I further evaluated the 4 and 6 cluster model. They went through an extremely stringent analysis of internal validation, stability measures. So for the stability measures, for instance, you remove one of the variables, rerun the cluster analysis to see does it change the results that you observe. You can also shuffle the order of the individuals within a group and see if that changes the order. Theoretical justification, and as we'll see later, external validation. And so using this, I chose the 6 cluster model to move forward with. So for model to meaning, so what we're looking at here are the centroids for on the y-axis and the individual GCA measures along the bottom. So first we see something called the overrider. So this is your ideal collaborative partner, I say jokingly, because this person, as you can see, they're participating a lot, but they have very low internal cohesion, social responsivity, and social impact. So they're making all these contributions, but it's not seen as meaningful by any other members of the group. They're not responsive to any other members of the group, so they're not necessarily invested in the social climate that's going on. They're also probably talking a lot to themselves, as you can see from the relationship between internal cohesion and their responsivity measures. So they have higher internal cohesion than they have for responsivity or social impact. This really is I think, the ideal partner. So they're participating a lot, but they also, when they participate, it's seen as meaningful. They're invested in the social climate of the group. And they're responsive to other individuals, as well as exhibiting these self-regulatory and monitoring processes. And if you look at their new information, they're midway between new information and communication density. I should mention that lower numbers on this graph just means that they were below average for the group, because they're standardized here. Cluster 3 was called the follower. These individuals do not participate very much, and they have mid-range social impact and overall responsivity, and very low newness. So it suggests that perhaps when they do participate, it's maybe just echoing previously given information that is actually seen as important by the group, but it's not necessarily their own idea. And finally, we have the lurker. And so this is somebody that's been debated a lot in the literature of whether or not a lurker is a positive or negative role. And I struggled over this label of calling it a ghost or a lurker, but I chose lurker because first, I don't know what their impact on the group will be. And second, the GCA methodology is not capable of capturing a ghost because you have to participate to some degree to be in the data set. But these individuals are low on everything. So they're not participating very much. When they do, it's not seen as meaningful, and so forth. And then we have this interesting character I labeled socially detached, which I think was a nice way to put it, because these individuals have the highest internal cohesion. So it's almost like they're just pushing their own agenda. They have low participation, but when they do talk, they're perhaps just repeating themselves or building on their own ideas, and they're not even aware or engaged in the social climate. And then we have a task leader. So this person, again, is participating very little, but when they do, it's seen as meaningful to the group. They're exhibiting these intrapersonal processes that help move a group forward. So the next step is I wanted to understand what is the so what? So you found these roles, you've developed this methodology. George has a question.
Yeah, can I interrupt?
Yeah.
So on your last one, did you look at all at to what degree did these profiles of these different participants depend on the nature of participants? Namely, is the overrider determined by the follower or by the lurker? If you had an overrider with a small group of lurkers and socially detached people, would his participation be more pronounced? Or did you just look at these as profiles of individuals regardless of who was around them or who was involved in those conversations?
So it's entirely dependent on who's around, right? So I can look, if I'm around a lot of lurkers or lurking type individuals and I participate minimally, and they in any way engage with my discussion, I can look like a driver. And
So this is not a persistent identity. It's a role that someone plays in a context.
right,
Okay.
exactly. Yes, and that's one of the main points of the GCA is that I want to capture that type of behavior because I think that obviously our roles change depending on who we're interacting with. Right? So the next question I had was so what? So another main goal was to understand what is the practical value of this information. Does this have any relationship to student or group learning? There's a wonderful paper that everyone should read, and it basically just points out this huge limitation in the literature, both in MOOCs and also mainly in small group interactions like computer-supported collaborative learning. Why are we not looking across all of these levels? There's obviously information here that can be used to inform the different levels, like the student, the group, and the interactions between students. But when researchers do this, they typically only focus on the student level or the overall group level, and they don't dive in to see what are the differences, what are the different results we might see if we looked across levels. So to do that, I looked at the relationship between the roles and student and group learning, which we talked about briefly earlier. I used a linear mixed effects model. So we had two models. The first one was the learner level model and the group level model. We had the dependent variables that we talked about, the proportional learning gains and the proportion of on-topic relevant discussion for group level, and the identified roles, and also the proportional occurrence of those identified roles for the group level model. So how many drivers were in a group, how many lurkers were in a group, and how did that influence the group level performance? And then finally with random variables. So we had learner nested within group for the learner level model, and then group for the group level model. And it's important to say that using this approach applies a very stringent test of the influence of these roles on learning, because it's accounting for all of the variance associated with individual learners and groups above and beyond what we want to look at, which is the roles. Right? So you build the full models, which are these, and then you also create null models. And you compare the null model to the full model to see, do the roles explain more variance than just the individual differences alone. You evaluated it using the AIC, log likelihood ratio tests, and two different versions of R-squared, the marginal and the conditional, which allow us to divide the variance to see how much variance are my independent variables alone accounting for versus the entire model. And this is something in normal regressions that people don't look at because they'll say, oh, I explained 45% of the variance. And that's your entire model and all of your noise as well. And using this method, you're allowed to see I just want to know what the roles predict. So first we'll look at how did the roles influence learner performance. So the first thing to take away is that there are significant differences in the roles and how individuals performed in these collaborative groups, with the driver outperforming the majority of the other roles. And one thing to note is because these are categorical predictors, the driver is the reference group. So everything is related to the driver, compared to the driver. Another interesting note is that it's not simply a product of being more prolific in a group. It's not that you talk a lot and that's why you have higher learning gains. Because we can see here the task leader who did not participate very much and the socially detached individual who did not participate very much also have no significant difference between their learning and that of the driver. However, the less socially engaged roles like lurker, overrider, and follower perform significantly worse, right? And then finally, it only explains about 2% of the variance in student learning. This will be meaningful in a second. Okay. So the next thing to look at is, what about group learning? So to do this, I divided the groups into two models. So we had a productive learner model and an unproductive learner model. For the productive learner model, we see a very similar trend where drivers, the higher proportion of drivers in a group, groups perform better. Also with task leaders. However, the effect for socially detached learners goes away. So just as a reminder, those were the individuals that only had high internal cohesion. So they were basically talking to themselves, and maybe that appears to be beneficial for their individual learning, but when it gets to the group level, it's not beneficial for group outcomes. And this model explained 15% of the variance. Similarly, for the unproductive role model, we saw a similar finding as in the individual learner role model, with the overriders, lurkers, and followers bringing down the overall group performance, right? So these individuals are hampering the discussions that are taking place in these environments. And again, this explained about 13% of the variance. So what this says to me is perhaps these roles are more important, or they have a more potent influence on the overall group outcome than the individual learner outcome. So we saw some things that were, I mean, you would suspect. So for instance, drivers outperformed lurkers, but we also found things that were less intuitive. So the differences between learners is not necessarily, in their learning gains, is not necessarily a product of simply being more prolific. It's really these intra and interpersonal processes that are driving this effect. Because a lot of the learners did not participate very much, but they still performed very well on the individual level, and also were beneficial to have in a group for the group outcomes. And I think that that's really fascinating, and it's something that's not captured by any other models currently out there. And it also has some implications for optimal group combinations. So simply high participating learners does not create the best environment. Sometimes you want some like balance. You want some individuals that are not participating very much. Maybe you want some people that are pausing and thinking, and then occasionally making a response that is seen as meaningful. And sometimes you want people that are just driving the conversation forward. They're participating a lot. They're responsive. But you don't necessarily need all of these high-performing learners in one group to achieve good results. And in fact, that actually might be detrimental because they're going to knock into each other in the group interaction. Okay. So now I've established that the roles do have practical value, at least in the learning context. And I wanted to see, do they generalize? So this is an important step in any unsupervised learning. You want to know whether or not the roles generalize beyond what the data set you've just explored it on. So to do this, I brought in two separate data sets. One is a SMOC or SMOOC. I call it SMOOC because it sounds cuter, but it's a synchronous massive open online course. I like this. Okay, well, first of all, it's much larger. So there were 1,700 people, and because they were organized into groups 9 different times throughout the semester, there were over 3,000 groups that we looked at. So I wanted this because it's similar enough to the previous data set in that it's also an intro sci class, the same teachers in the same university, but they talked about a variety of different topics, not just one 5-minute or 10-minute interaction. The second data set I brought in was a collaborative problem solving. So I wanted to see, does this generalize to an even more different situation, which is a virtual agent in a virtual environment where students go in and they're doing city planning. So they have to problem solve with each other in groups about the different stakeholders within a city and satisfying their needs. This was a smaller data set. It had 38 participants and 630 groups because individuals, again, interacted in multiple rooms in this virtual environment. So the main idea here, again, is to see how far can I push this methodology and when does it break or appear to be less meaningful. So here we have all of the possible data sets that we just talked about, and then they were all split into testing and training. And to look at internal and external generalizability, we calculate all possible combinations and try different bootstrapping and replication analyses to evaluate this. So I'm going to walk through one example and then I'll give you all of the results at once because I can't go through all possible 18 combinations without you falling asleep. So the main idea here is you take the cluster centers from one training data set and you attempt to predict and you run cluster analysis on all the other data sets, and then you attempt to predict the cluster centers in another data set. If you have high internal and external generalizability, then you would like to see high overlap between these cluster analyses. To evaluate this, you can look at cross-tabulation tables, which you can then quantify, we'll see one in a minute, quantify using the adjusted RAND index. And so this is basically a measure of agreement. So when I run a cluster analysis on one data set, and I run it on a separate data set, and then I take these cluster centers to predict those in the testing data set, how much agreement is there between those two cluster analysis partitions? And then Kramer V is just a measure of effect size. So for the ARI, excellent values are around 0.9. Moderate values are 0.6 and above, and I think 0.6 and below is poor. So for example, I take the training data from the traditional CSCL data set and I predict the cluster centers in the testing data set. And the first thing you do is just look to see, does it make sense visually? And I was really surprised that it aligned almost identical with the ones observed in the training data set. You can quantify this agreement by looking at the adjusted RAND index using the cross-tabulation table. So here, you would like to see the high numbers along the diagonal. Anything off the diagonal suggests that something was misclassified. And then we can quantify that with the ARI, which was 0.83, which suggests it was very high agreement between the training data set and the testing data set, which suggests high internal generalizability. Everybody follow me there? Okay. So again, I did this for all possible combinations, and I'm about to plot all of the adjusted RAND index here, and then the predictor data sets at the bottom. So first we'll just look at internal generalizability. So the blue bar is representing the internal generalizability we just walked through. So you're seeing the 0.86 adjusted RAND index that we talked about a moment ago. We see even higher internal generalizability for the SMOOC data set, and similarly for the land science data set. So yes, these do appear to be robust, at least in terms of being able to predict unseen data within the same data set. Next, looking at the external generalization. So if I take the clusters from the traditional CSCL data set and I attempt to predict the SMOC data set, how well can I do that? And the first thing to notice is that there's a drop in accuracy. But this is to be expected when you're bringing in external data. But overall, the accuracy is still well above the cutoff threshold, and so it's moderate. The highest accuracy was seen by the traditional CSCL data set being predicted by the land science data set. So the take home from this is that the GCA appears to be a robust methodology for identifying roles. We see good generalization both within and between data sets, and that these roles seem to be a bit context dependent. And so that's because we saw the slight drop in accuracy below what we might like for the collaborative problem-solving data set. Now, this doesn't mean that the GCA methodology isn't valid. It just means that if you transfer this to new environments, you need to take care in interpreting your roles that are that come out of that analysis. So, onward and upward. So this, I just wanted to show a few preliminary findings on something I'm really, really excited about, which is I'm talking about emergent roles. This is for the last 40 minutes or so. but I haven't said that I haven't defined or showed you that they were actually emergent. So that's the work I'm focusing on right now, along with some other lines of research that we'll talk about. But I want to know, are these roles really emergent, or am I just capturing your personality? Is this how you always are? And it has nothing to do with your conversational behaviors that I've spent all this work trying to capture, and it's just who you are. So to do this, I set up two different claims. The first one is, if the roles are indeed emergent, they should not be consistently or highly associated with trait-based characteristics. And the second is, if roles are emergent, they will not be static, but instead will change in different contexts, as George hinted at earlier. And so to test the first claim, I took the big 5 personality factors, so these are trait-based personality measures, and I looked at their relationship with both the individual GCA measures as well as the roles that we identified. So the first thing we're looking at is just the correlation at the top. So there does seem to be some small, moderate relationships, which is to be expected between the big 5 personality factors and the individual GCA measures. But overall, they're not consistent, and they're quite small. Second, I used a discriminant function analysis to say, can I predict these roles using the big 5 personality factors, and to what degree? It was a very, very poor prediction using the discriminant function analysis, with openness only moderately having any relationship to the roles. So to me, this suggests there's limited evidence to support the fact that these are trait-based characteristics. The second claim is that they will not be static, but should shift and change in different contexts. And so if you remember the SMOOP data set, people interacted in 9 different group interactions over the course of a semester. So I can actually see, if you're a driver in one role, and on one day, are you a driver every day throughout the semester? That would suggest that these roles are not emergent. So just visually looking at this, so at the bottom we have the 9 different chat days and the frequency of that role. So the first thing is, there is some variation in the roles that could be accounted for by maybe students were absent on that day, maybe people dropped the course. But to me, they're just visually looking at this, there's way too much variation to suggest that that could explain all of the variation that we're seeing here. Second, I did a state transition network to see the degree to which these roles are exhibiting the transitions. An individual's transition from one role to another role can be explained by randomness. So that's another thing. It could be either they're trait-based, but it also could be that they're random. I walk in today, this is just what I was doing. It has nothing to do with my interactional partners. And that analysis showed that it was much more likely that it was an emergent process that was a product of the individuals you're interacting with. So it's these interpersonal processes that are deriving the role that you occupy at that moment. And I just said all of this. So the takeaway here is just that so far with this preliminary research, it looks like it's an emergent process. And going forward, I'm going to look at other methods because I want a third claim to test, and then I'll be publishing that. So the GCA appears to be a robust method for identifying roles. The identified roles have practical value, and also that they generalize so far to different contexts. And I should say that I recently applied this in the MOOC context as well, and they seem to be robust there. And in another context, which I'll talk about right now. So next steps. What we just looked at were averages, which is what most researchers look at. I have all of the data from the temporal dynamics, and it's possible that individuals shift roles within an interaction, right? So that's something I haven't played with yet, and I really want to get into that, especially over longer term social interactions. For instance, crowdsource interactions that take place over multiple weeks online, like design teams. And there's a lot of information that can be gained there. There's a lot of things I feel like are missing. So when I set out for this project, I wanted to say, who are we and how can I characterize and quantify that? And so I came up with these sociocognitive based measures based on the literature. A huge thing missing is an affective component. It's obvious that emotions play a role in who we are and how we interact with other individuals, and that other individuals' emotions influence us, right? And that's a missing component here. Also, topic relevancy is another one that I want to include. So external from the language characteristics, there's tons of behavioral data that takes place in online learning environments that can help further characterize the roles that individuals occupy. And that could be like how many, all the things that we see in every learning analytics paper. How many click streams did they do in this one video? How many rewinds did they, how many times did they rewind a video? All of that information is important, and I think it can further contextualize the roles, as well as demographic variables. And then finally, I'm interested in seeing, so right now we've been looking at learning, which is wonderful and a goal of a lot of ours here in the room, but there are other ways to think about growth, right? It's not just my learning gains or, you know, how much I was on topic. What about creativity? What about cultivating skills that are outside of the traditional skills that we always look at, cognitive skills? So one ongoing project here that I hinted at earlier was this crowdsourced design-based interaction. So these are, I don't know if anybody's familiar with OpenIDEO, but the idea behind this is somebody with a lot of money has a problem that they want to solve, a problem that is important to the society. So for instance, one is like, how do we get more people to donate bone marrow? And then they bring these people together. It's a very distributed group of individuals. They interact for 4 weeks, and they just go through iteratively and make all these ideas. And then finally they submit an idea, and it's judged by an expert panel on creativity and feasibility of the idea. And then that money, which is usually like millions of dollars, I think, is then used to actually implement that idea, which I think is just a fascinating test bed to sort of see how can we measure creativity. Can GCA capture the dynamics related to creativity that lead to creativity? So that's something I'm really interested in. And then finally, I want to thank George for bringing me in, George the Great, and all of my wonderful collaborators, without which I could not have done any of this. And I'll take questions.
Thanks very much, Nia. I think particularly questions around, is this only a learning game or learning scenarios, especially with the interest that you see coming out with PISA and other international rankings trying to get at some of the less pronounced cognitive types of activities. So,
right.
You know, looking at creativity, can you define and measure that? Are the roles that we're going to play vary when it's an explicitly collaborative task that we're engaged in versus when it's a learning task, which is generally viewed as being more individualistic attempt. So, meaning if we were to sit down and say, hey, we have to design a new car, would we still play the same 6 roles that you've identified as if we are all learning about Stats 101 and we're involved in discussion around that? So I think that's a fairly interesting avenue. Have you started looking at any data sets that would broaden GCA outside of a learning-only setting, or is that more just you're flagging it as we get at this point?
No. So that OpenIDEO data set with the creativity as the outcome measure, I've started looking at, I've analyzed that and started looking at it actually with Sasha Phuket. So we're actually combining GCA with social network analysis to understand how these two analytical techniques can be used to understand creativity. So that I can come back and talk about it. Yeah.
Seems like getting a broader definition of that. I'm curious though, what do we expect to get from the SNA combination other than the structural dimensions of interactions?
That's a good question. So initially the SNA portion was brought in because of some collaborators we had that were more familiar with that and wanted to use something that they knew. And then I started thinking more about it, and I'm interested to sort of see how these things are related. So I intuitively know I'm capturing the structural elements with the GCA measures, not to the degree that SNA does, but I wanted to sort of see, can these complement each other, or is SNA no longer needed?
See, I would think it's not. Because
so far it's leading that way, but
yeah, SNA treats a node as a persistent identity,
right.
where you are explicitly saying roles need to change. So an SNA analysis would be kind of useless if there's rapid changes in roles. If you assume each role then is a node, unless you're running a SNA of each role transition simultaneously, which would be
Right. So far the individual measures from SNA and the individual GCA measures, there's just, SNA doesn't appear to add anything. But I haven't done the latter that you just discussed. So I haven't used each node as a role or explored it in that way. But
I would be curious just thinking about kind of like context and say if you were, because when you went into that kind of the online thing where they were working together, they're still all basically on the same level. Everyone is a student or everyone is
right.
a contributor. I'm wondering what would happen like when you put it into maybe more of a corporate environment. So I'm curious, like if you gave everyone a role and said, here's your role for this task, if they would have that role where they would take on something natural.
So, I mean, that's an interesting question. I'm sure I could.
But it gets to that point you said where you said that the personality changed. It didn't matter. You showed that it wasn't predictive.
It wasn't predictive. But I wouldn't.
Curious if you said this is your role, kind of like if you're in a workplace environment and then you're going to have the leader that's in the group and how that would change. Would that person always remain the driver if they're supposed to?
If they're supposed to be playing another role. I honestly, like I said in the very beginning, that entire area of assigned roles, I think it has a lot of limitations, but I do think it would be interesting to look at some of the analyses that people have done with the assigned roles and then analyze it with the GCA to see the degree to which they exhibit the behaviors associated with their assigned role versus the person that or the way that they're interacting right now. And that's because I suspect, without data to back it up, that just because somebody's assigned a particular role does not mean that they're going to enact that role.
Would self-awareness play a big role, though?
Oh.
Meaning, rather than assigning, if we said these are the profiles that you play, just helping people understand the different interaction patterns that we contribute to. So making it a self-regulation activity rather than a instructor-defined activity.
Yes. So we talked about that earlier, I think, a little bit. I mean, just in terms of providing feedback. And I talked about that with Chris at Michigan. So providing people feedback based on the GCA, sort of saying, hey, you didn't incorporate a lot of George's critique in this. Maybe you want to reflect a bit more on that in your contribution and elaborate there. Or, hey, I think you missed Stephen's comment earlier when he mentioned all of these issues with common ground, and maybe you want to think about that a bit more. So I think these measures could be used in that way to feed back into the system. And so that's getting at sort of teaching or helping scaffold these self-regulation and social awareness skills. And so again, I think it's less of like you play this role. These are the things involved in that role and we're trying to help them cultivate those.
Did I read that correctly? All those roles that 6 of them brought newness, so that they're all negative on the newness.
Oh, right. So for that figure, everything was standardized. So anything that was negative meant that they were just below average. And so I can go back to it, but they were. A lot of newness is a narrow construct, especially in a group environment where you're told to speak about a certain thing. But there is still room for newness. So if you saw that there was actually varying degrees of negative. So some people, like the average was probably below 0. And then there were some people that were, negative 0.5 or something versus negative 0.02. So there is variance. It doesn't mean that it's not there. It's just below average.
So I was thinking of the classroom application because I have an online master's level course, and I'm thinking about about to grade their first set of discussions. Would there be something they could read or something so that when I start to talk to them about, really pushing the conversation forward, something like that to help them, to help give us a common thing to start with?
Yeah, most definitely. So I mean, the paper that I attached for this, even the theoretical overview section, it really goes into the motivation behind each of the 6 dimensions, and it's probably 2 or 3 pages, so it's not a lot, just the theory section. So it outlines why these certain attributes are important and what they are representative of by other members, but also what their contribution to the group is.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Do you have access to it?
I don't know.
Okay, well, you just email me.
Thanks.
Any other questions? Okay,
All right. Well, thanks very much, Nia. That was
thank
great.
you.